we've heard of at least three universities that have confirmed some level of slowdown in the spending. The degree of which that slowdown is taking place is still relatively unknown, at least to me. But Cornell, UPenn, and Pittsburgh, at least as of taping this episode, have all put large reductions in headcount, at least in the PhD programs. So they're bringing on less PhD students because they simply can't guarantee the funding that would otherwise kind of have been guaranteed in this kind of new light of funding, freezes and kind of the stoppage of these meetings that are taking place. And that's affecting people at all kind of rungs of the PhD process. So new cohorts can't come in. Some of the cohorts that are already in PhD programs that might have otherwise had their funding guaranteed, or their work was previously being funded, they now don't know exactly when that money's coming, if that money's going to be reallocated. I know a lot of.
Show would be out a little. Show would be out a little.
All right, Damon, how's the PhD going?
It's good. It's good. We are coming into the home stretch of things. A lot of writing, a lot of polishing of data sets, that kind of thing. And then we're headed into a world of a little bit of uncertainty, I think. So myself, people more broadly, I think that the universities are seeing a little bit of a shakeup in response to some of the funding freezes, especially with respect to the NIH, the NSF, a lot of the funding agencies that are typically responsible for providing funding, providing guidance for a lot of these research projects, mine included, are going through transition right now. And sometimes some parts of that transition are good, some parts of that transition are bad, but I think it has everybody, Duke as an institution included, taking new assessment on these kind of things.
What ends up obviously there have been labs, I'm sure, that at a time when they need funding, they're not able to. What are the typical avenues for a research lab in this moment right now to go through?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm far from the most knowledgeable about kind of this system as a kind of an entire entity, but just speaking from my experiences and speaking from what I understand about kind of how this works typically, especially in R1 institutions, Duke, and similar within even in kind of the other non-R1 institutions like the undergraduate university from which I came and did research. At the R1 institutions, there is some capital pooling, capital sharing, and so there are indirect costs associated with all these grants that go to helping fund support staff, admin, common things like electricity bills or universal supplies that might be used. So there is some resource sharing in that sense. That said, all PIs essentially operate as small businesses inside of the universities, and they're kind of responsible for maintaining their own funds. And so you're going to see some PIs that are struggling, meaning they might have to take on more of a teaching role, especially in the non-R1 institutions, to help support their lab efforts or to kind of keep them afloat, so to speak, until there is more funding dedicated for the labs. Otherwise, universities are moving some funds around to help support people in this kind of time of uncertainty. And then as a last resort, a lot of these universities are scaling back a lot of the funding efforts that they had previously allocated. So we've heard of at least three universities that have confirmed some level of slowdown in the spending. The degree of which that slowdown is taking place is still relatively unknown, at least to me. But Cornell, UPenn, and Pittsburgh, at least as of taping this episode, have all put large reductions in headcount, at least in the PhD programs. So they're bringing on less PhD students because they simply can't guarantee the funding that would otherwise kind of have been guaranteed in this kind of new light of funding, freezes and kind of the stoppage of these meetings that are taking place. And that's affecting people at all kind of rungs of the PhD process. So new cohorts can't come in. Some of the cohorts that are already in PhD programs that might have otherwise had their funding guaranteed, or their work was previously being funded, they now don't know exactly when that money's coming, if that money's going to be reallocated. I know a lot of the grant managers, project managers, that kind of thing, that were in previous positions at the NIH or otherwise have been either reassigned, they have moved on, maybe electively, maybe have been let go for one reason or the other. And so there's just a lot of flux, a lot of uncertainty. And I think that is affecting both the attractiveness of a PhD right now and also the prospects of people that are post-PhD.
So what are the major career options? Where do people look after maybe the last year of people that you know finishing PhDs? Do you see many of them anecdotally going in toward industry or trying to get postdocs? Like what are the viable alternatives?
It's a good question. And I mean, the landscape is very much shifting, right? I mean, a lot of this like quote unquote uncertainty is the result of the last, call it 4 to 5 weeks. And so people are kind of in real time
Hmm.
reacting to these things, right? A lot of these fundings that would have otherwise been there from the universities, like people are having postdocs canceled as an example. Like they thought they were going to go to do a postdoc this summer, but now all of a sudden that money is not there for them. So those people are obviously pivoting. That might mean into a different postdoc at a different, hopefully better funded or maybe otherwise funded university, or it does mean some sort of industry kind of apprenticeship, internship, or something like that. And so it is, I certainly wouldn't call it panic, at least not in my most immediate peer group, but I think there is a level of discovery right now that's happening kind of across the board of what is my next step. And the safest of all those bets is to look into the private sector in which the funding for those companies, whether it be, the biggest of the few, Johnson and Johnson, Novo Nordisk, GSK, those kind of things. I mean, there's many others, but those industrial positions are, probably more stable at the moment. Although, again, as we've talked about many times on this podcast and elsewhere, the macroeconomic environment of hiring is kind of down across the board, especially in tech and biotech. So I do think, while I think most people will remain optimistic, that there are headwinds. I think candidly, I'm curious. Like, say you've got a lot of peers, friends, that kind of thing in similar phases or kind of
Lakshay has
various
friends?
phases.
No way.
Yeah,
Excuse me. What the hell?
yeah.
I'm the personality hire of this group. Put some respect on my name. What the hell? the a lot of them who are in PhD, so they're all pretty like far along, maybe like 2 or 3 years in. Some of them are like close to wrapping. A lot of them are very like concerned for what it means for folks who are just entering. For folks who have been in it, they're not super worried. Like again, all my friends who are in PhDs, they're in like tech PhDs too. So like they never had the intention of going to a postdoc or anything like that. They they all very much want to go straight to industry. So I don't think that concern really worries them that much. Obviously, there's still like stuff happening in the tech sector generally. Like we're still seeing layoffs and a bunch of kind of like clearing waves happening every now and again from big companies. But nothing that's like really pressing anyone too much. I don't think I know anyone who's trying to go into a PhD like this year. I haven't heard of anyone like having to deal with like a rescinded offer or a deferred offer on the PhD program or anything yet. But at least from my friend circle, everyone seemed pretty okay because they're in the middle of it still, and it seems like their universities are at least talking in a way that seems to be that resources are committed.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, PhDs are cheap. They're
yeah.
like the cheap labor in the system. Um, but I can imagine the more expensive labor in the system is probably where you would try to find cuts first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
The,
think it's that, and I think it's the PhD itself, like the PhD salary is cheap relative. That's 100% true, but the funds that are going to provide the supplies necessary to do these fairly capital intensive PhDs, I think are where the question is, right? Because
Mm.
where, yes, my salary is quite cheap. The reagents that I need to perform my experiments and the equipment I need to perform the experiments on are not cheap. And like the grant money funds both of those things. And in the case of that money not being available, while you certainly could scrap enough together to pay the people, like, do you have enough to then also run the experiments and publish the results? I think is where people's concern is. And I think to be clear, most of the universities aren't necessarily in problematic space. They're just more or less taking a wait and see approach before overcommitting themselves and putting themselves in kind of a perilous position.
It is interesting. I mean, not necessarily our position, but especially over the time that we've been building Scholar, I've been exposed to a number of startups who are doing like grant searching or like funding, finding work for researchers. I do really wonder how those groups are doing because their whole thing was being able to like work through government funding opportunities and find those for other folks. It was just a very, very popular like AI LM verticalized space that I have to assume is like being very, very highly stress tested right now.
All right, let's jump into a topic. We had two product launches this week. We had Sonnet 3.7 and we had GPT 4.5. Guys, have you used either of those? What do you think?
I've used both. 4.5, I think my perception of 4.5 is that they've had this model in the works for a long while, like before they like had the big launch of the reasoning models. And it is fully unsupervised. It's like a traditional LM model that has better base knowledge without any specialized training. But I do think it's kind of an underwhelming announcement, not because it's a bad innovation necessarily or it's like bad technological process and progress, but simply because it feels mostly like a stylistic upgrade, and we've gotten used to like knowledge and style and all this other sort of stuff being mutatable at a base level anyway. um so kind of ignorable in my opinion. It does better on a good number of benchmarks, which is fine, but not something that's kind of blowing my socks off or anything. Claude 3.7 I've played with in the context of Cursor and trying to code with it. I was mentioning this to Damon earlier, but there's a UX thing on like reasoning models looking normal in Cursor that feels kind of terrible to use. But so far, I haven't noticed like a big performance difference, but I haven't been paying too much attention to it.
Yeah, I'll take it in reverse order to Lakshay because I have far more thoughts on the 4.5 release than I do on the 3.7 release from Sonnet. The 3.7 release, to me, because most of my use and interaction with Claude is in their UI, has been maybe marginally improved, but otherwise unchanged. All the things that I was doing before, all the data processing I was having Claude help me with, all the kind of brainstorming I was having Claude help me with, it all feels relatively the same. Even if I can perceive some small change, it feels relatively unremarkable. Um, the GPT 4.5 release, I've been monitoring closely. I've been using it myself, and I think there's a little bit of a gap in people's recognition of what GPT 4.5 is. And what I mean by that is, as Lakshay mentioned, on the benchmarks, it's not overwhelmingly impressive. Comparing it to O1 or O3 or DeepSeek or otherwise, it kind of seems underwhelming. That said, GPT-5, what it marks in my brain is an improvement in pre-training that tell us that we haven't yet reached the upper threshold for that technique. By throwing more data, maybe even the same amount of data, it's unclear to me at the moment because the knowledge cutoff is still October 23 in the 4.5 stated docs. It's unclear to me whether or not GPT 4.5 was actually trained on different or more data than GPT 4.0, or if it was just more compute, more parameters, etc. Anyway, independent of any of that, the point is the fact that GPT 4.5 is any incremental step forward means there's still more metaphorical juice to be squeezed out of the pre-training fruit. And so that combined with improvements in chain of thought to then layer reasoning models on top of, I think means that we are still going to be taking strides for the foreseeable future in kind of intelligence. Because a better base model, if you want to call it that, leads to better reasoning models down the road. And I think that's the thing that's being overlooked with the 4.5 release. And then as a final note on that, I did see in some benchmarks where the hallucination rate has fallen in 4.5, which I do think is, again, a stepping stone to an actual step change that this model in and of itself does not represent.
Can
On
you play
GPT
that
4
question?
on GPT 4.5, have you ever bought a car and the salesperson wants to sell you like a bunch of options that you're like,
Hmm.
well, none of that stuff is going to matter to my like actual
Hmm.
experience with this car, but they're all
Hmm.
really expensive, and that's where they like. That's sort of my reaction to GPT 4.5. I saw the token costs for it, and I thought this is like stupidly expensive, and I would have to be blown away to use this instead of one of the other many models available. And I didn't feel like, from what I had read, I didn't feel like there was enough value there to pay that much of a premium. There is one thing I want to just highlight, which I think is a really good step, is that Sam Altman mentioned that in the near future they won't have all these model names available because they've sort of made a mess of all these models and model names, and he was acknowledging how kind of difficult that is to figure out like which model do I use for which situation. And so instead of offering a whole bunch of models, they're going to simplify it and have a model selector kind of pass the request to the right thing in the background, I think for most cases that will be better. For some people, they'll want to really kind of tune either for cost, probably most likely. I'm thinking if you want to really manage your costs, you might want to have the option to pick which model, um, or for performance, be able to choose your model. So they probably will reserve that for power users who are going to know the difference. But for most people, having not having to choose your model and just drop your question in is going to be better. On Sonnet, on the Sonnet 3.7 release, my primary interaction is via cursor, and in my experience, it's pro and con. The pro is that I saw it doing more thinking and planning before execution. The con of it is that, at least in my anecdotal experience, it got stuck more often. And so I reverted to 3.5 and got unstuck pretty quickly with the very same query. I would just go back and restore to that point and then switch models, and then 3.5 would be able to get through the task. Maybe it was getting through the task with less intelligence per se. I kind of believe that from kind of seeing the logical paths, but it was not getting stuck, at least in my experience.
Out of curiosity, Shashi, because I think that's an important maybe anecdote. There was the code that resulted from 3.5 working at the end, because like the way that I'm kind of
Hmm.
digesting that as you're saying it is that 3.7 is kind of working its way through a logical process to like solve the prompt that you've given it, and it's kind of running into a hurdle that it's taking either more time with, or it says like, I don't know, I can't figure this out, whereas 3.5 might just be blitzing through what maybe should be a hurdle, but it's just no, it's kind of ignoring it and saying, okay, I'm going to do this anyway. I'm curious what you think the overall quality is from the result of that 3.5 output.
I was satisfied with the output. Actually, what I was doing is I was using the 3.7 thinking model to write the planning document. So I
Yep.
would write a markdown planning document first, and then I would attach that to my next. I would start a new cursor agentic composer window, and then use and attach the planning document, the markdown document, to the next query. And then I would use 3.7, the regular 3.7, not the thinking model. It would go through, it would get some things done, it would get stuck, and then I would go back and then redo that with 3.5, and it would not get stuck. That was my anecdotal experience, but I wasn't relying on it to plan and do at the same time, if
Mhm.
that was what you're asking.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
I
no,
haven't
that answers the question. Yeah. Go ahead, Lexi.
I haven't obviously like 3.7 is what that announcement was like, it's 4 days old at this point. I haven't tried like since last night, but I'd assume that the cursor team is testing and like doing evals with cursor and the new Claude model, simply because the way that the agentic mode was prompted previously kind of had like a thinking step baked in, right? If you'd say like, go ahead, like look at my code base, do XYZ thing, there it always had like a planning rag sequence of steps where I'd look for your code and then go back. Whereas this wants to do its own reasoning before it executes. And it's just like the UI is not exactly like perfect in that way. Like the sequence of steps that I assume that the Claude 3.5 prompt has feels a little incorrect for what the 3.7 one should have. So we'll get there. I think especially like the thing I noticed is that the 3.7 output would put in brackets like thinking or something similar around its reasoning steps, and that just like looks really ugly in the UI, which I assume they're probably going to solve by like next week, just make it better for the model, which should be okay. I do think the 4.5 part of this is, I think it's pretty high upside for vocal agents. Well, they did a comparison for like, I don't know if you guys saw the live stream when they announced 4.5, but they're even in their own marketing, they seem to kind of recognize that this is not like some big crazy jump that anyone's going to be super excited by. But they kind of highlighted the stylistic differences very intensely, where the nature of the question and the way that they're answered just sounds a lot more human in general. And the overall like user happiness in hearing the way that the questions were answered was just generally higher, right? It uses much more personality. It has a little bit more exclamation points and um, thinks about questions thoughtfully while still having like a human element to it, rather than straight factual like the O1 model might do, rather than focusing on just like outputting as much information to seem correct as possible. The overall, I guess, human friendliness of the model seems higher, and I assume that'll be positive for when we get to the point that vocal agents are a little bit more commonplace. But right now, it does definitely pale in the scales of measuring intelligence.
I think for me, the the thing that is somewhat fascinating, I think, is to Shashi, to your point, it does feel a little bit like this announcement for 4.5 might have been accelerated based on recent announcements from DeepSeek. They knew that Google had made some announcements. They knew Anthropic was coming out with 3.7, that kind of thing. It does feel a little bit like this is probably an announcement that's on its way to a novel release, whether it's GPT-5 or otherwise. And it felt like they were losing or didn't want to cede ground in the news cycle to others. And I think that might have been what largely prompted this, this kind of, again, to your point, selling of things that may not completely affect the core experience, but that may, you know, bake in some a bit of novelty on the edges. I'm curious, when you guys are using ChatGPT, what's the model that you select? Like, what's your default model? Whether you're
Hmm.
like in the UI, not like in the API or anything like that, or are you even using ChatGPT in the UI?
It depends on what I'm doing. I'll oftentimes just like for vanilla questions, just like thought partner, like just ideating a thing or just trying to analyze an image. Um 4.5 or 4.0 has been fine, or 4.0 mini. I don't know what the default one is. I think it's 4.0. When it comes to coding and stuff that like cursor gets stuck on, I'll grab that context and dump it into an O1 or an O3 typically. I haven't found much reason to use anything else. I haven't been using like the tasks or anything or any of those like kind of specialized UI instances of the app. But all in all, O1, O3, and 4.0 generally.
Mhm.
I typically use O1, and only because I've just kind of gotten used to what the interaction is like, and it's reliable. It does what I need it to do for the use cases where when I go to ChatGPT, I'm usually doing something that is similar to a Google search, but just looking for an agent. So that's my replacement for kind of a more thoughtful Google search rather than kind of if I'm looking directly for an item, then I would just go to Google. If I'm looking for some kind of thought or lightweight reasoning, I would go to ChatGPT. And so that in that use case, one has just been good. And I think this is, how, in terms of how do humans use AIs, this is probably, the step we're in where there's so many different AIs that the relative difference is pretty small. So people are probably going to find something they like and basically stick with it. We're going to start seeing more stickiness just because the delta between these new releases, as we said earlier, with GPT 4.5 and with Sonnet 3.7, the deltas are getting smaller, even if they're getting better. So people are probably just going to find a comfort zone and stick with it.
The reason I asked that question, I wondered if we were going to do this. I use O3 Mini the most. That's my default. I just think it's kind of fascinating as being three people who are pretty entrenched in this world, building with it on a relatively daily basis, how the three of us have kind of gravitated towards three different defaults, all under the same ecosystem. Like I think to your point, Shashi, like correctly or incorrectly, human beings just kind of default to a known behavior pattern. And like once you kind of get comfortable with the way that O1's interacting with you or O3 or the speed of 4.0, etc., I do think you just end up back there. I want to kind of go on a little bit of a tangent though, based on something you said, Shashi, and I'll share an anecdote. And I shared this with Lakshay over Slack, but um, my wife and I were in New York City this last weekend for a Duke event. Went to the Madison Square Garden, or went to the game at Madison Square Garden, etc. A lot of fun. But the thing that's relevant for this conversation is I found myself as I was had downtime looking for ways to explore different parts of the city we hadn't been to before, maybe looking for food or entertainment recommendations during downtime. I was using ChatGPT more than I was using Google. And if I was using Google, it was in the Google Maps interface. So it was very specifically like what's around me. Okay, I understand what's around me. Chat GPT or chat, what do you think of these options? What are good, not pizza places because like we got a Joe's Pizza when we're there, but so, some other, taco place or whatever. And so I that was the first time where yes, Google has mostly been replaced in my brainstorming, with an AI agent, but I had previously always relied on Google when it was like, I want to buy this thing or I want to go find this, thing in the real world. This was the first time I had experienced myself not doing that and instead defaulting to ChatGPT to help me with those experiences. So any response to that, either one
Yeah,
of you?
I mean, obviously, I was a very early adopter of what ChatGPT is and what the interface has become, and I think we would generally find that someone who is like 20s, like early 20s or younger, GPT is the default way to get information. I don't use Google anymore, aside from like if I'm on my computer and I'm trying to shop for something, I will go to Google, look up the company I'm trying to shop at, go to their page, then shop. Or I'll go to Amazon. But basically anything else, I'm only using GPT. I'm using it to find like, hey, what are like options? I sent a picture of this. I was looking for sugar-free blueberry preserves a week ago. I was just trying to find like what companies like sell sugar-free blueberry preserves, and then try and find me stores where I can go get that. It didn't do a great job for the record. I mean, like what the only place that would really answer that question is like an Instacart, effectively. But it was pretty impressive because it was able to like render a Google Map view inside of the app. It was able to show me like a markdown table of this one has this many calories. Here's how much like sugar alcohol is in this one. We would recommend this one if you're just trying to get something that's flavorful or whatever. Here's what the internet says about it. And I haven't had a need, and I think especially with the nature of like ads and blogs and SEO muddying up most websites, I've in general defaulted to ChatGPT for any sort of information. If I'm in a city looking for something to do, I ask ChatGPT for ideas because it knows my context and sort of things I like to do.
All right, let's change gears here. So there's been this theory on the Twitterverse, Xverse, that the identity of Satoshi is perhaps right in front of our faces, and we just haven't seen it. And so the theory is that Jack Dorsey, the founder of Square, Block, and Twitter, is actually Satoshi. And so I'd like to just read you some of the evidence and get your reaction. The first piece of evidence is that Dorsey was a known cipher. He was a known cipher punk kid in computer science days. He wore RSA encryption T-shirts often, and so his skills in coding and understanding this space were well known. The second is that the first transaction occurred. The first Bitcoin transaction occurred on Dorsey's mother's birthday, and Satoshi's last mined block was on Dorsey's father's birthday. The next is that Satoshi talked about the idea of public keys having some kind of unique identifier, kind of like a personal vanity license plate or a phone number. And the Satoshi public key, one of them had JD2M as a part of that key. Jack Dorsey's address at that time was 2 Mint Street in San Francisco, 2 Mint Plaza. And so that some are taking as perhaps evidence that Dorsey is actually Satoshi. Satoshi's last message was, quote, moved on to other things, which coincided with Dorsey's increased focus on Twitter and Square. And lastly, Dorsey was asked directly by Lex Fridman if he was Satoshi, and he said sort of playfully, "No, and if I were, would I tell you?" So, guys, what do you think? Is Jack Dorsey actually Satoshi?
For anyone listening, do you want to set the context of what Satoshi means? Because I think if you're not in the cryptoverse, that word
yes.
phrase means absolutely nothing.
Okay, so Satoshi was the inventor, writer of the white paper and then the blockchain called Bitcoin, with the idea that humans want liberty. Governments are often at the intersection of that human liberty equation, and if money existed separate from governments, and that if money was simply a transference of electricity into a blockchain, then there would be an independently verifiable blockchain in which money could change hands without being controlled by banks and or by governments. And so that was the origin and invention of Bitcoin. And Satoshi is the pseudonym for the inventor of Bitcoin, whose identity has never been revealed.
My gut reaction is I in general my exposure to Jack Dorsey has been as him as a very suspect person generally, who I think in the founding history of Twitter has not behaved in very rational or intelligent ways. Like he's been very much a dude walking with a knife around him generally. And so I don't give him too much credit as a technical person. I'm sure he's very smart, but I don't think not in the way that like would lend himself to being a I'm going to redefine economics sort of angle.
No, this is fascinating. I'm reacting kind of in real time. I've heard of most of these things, like most of. So you introduced some new information there, Shashi, to me. Like I hadn't, like for example, the trailing character to the hash, or wherever they were placing the hash, is new information to me. But I had heard this kind of Jack Dorsey as Satoshi, theory, whatever you want to call it, idea before. To me, this is similar. So like in short, I have no idea. And honestly, simply don't really care one way or the other whether it's him or not. Like I think that his response on Lex Friedman, which I haven't seen by the way, but just in responding to the way that you framed it, is exactly what I would expect. Because in either way, like the unknown of whether Jack Dorsey is or is not is more valuable to him than the known in either direction. So like I think it makes perfect sense that he would, the more mystery he can shroud himself in around the situation and speculation, the better off he and maybe the whole project is in the event that he would be this person. To me, who Satoshi is immaterial, and it's fun to speculate about. I'm here for that. But I don't know. I mean, I think that my experience with Jack Dorsey is only through third party information. Um, Similar to Lukshay, he seems intelligent, but maybe not ultimately capable or incentivized to create a new financial system from scratch. That said, he has been vocal about this idea of decentralization, Times Square on Twitter, and then the things that have kind of become on the back of Twitter since he kind of concluded his time there. So I think that yeah, ultimately I don't know. I mean, I'll wait on more information. This uh, this is reminiscent of things that gained popularity around like me entering undergrad, which was the Illuminati became a big thing for a while. Everybody that was like there was music videos and um, various handshakes that were happening on like the NBA teams, like throughout NBA kind of culture, was like directly tied to this kind of conspiracy of the Illuminati running everything. And so um, this is like sending kind of almost deja vu in the sense that like this is a very different topic, obviously, but is kind of I think of a similar ethos where um, if you're Jay-Z or you're LeBron or you're Kesha or any other popular artist around that time, it's more inherently valuable to you to be shrouded in maybe I am, maybe I'm not, than it is to come out and outright accept it or reject it. And so like we'll probably see this play out in the zeitgeist. I don't know how materially impactful it is to Bitcoin's overall utility or otherwise, but good for fodder for the new experts, I suppose.
This is the most plausible theory I've heard in terms of the identity of Satoshi. I haven't heard another actual human being put forward that would be more plausible than this theory. And for just to kind of help with the calculation, the current expected value of the Satoshi wallets would be it's roughly 1 million Bitcoin, or roughly 100 billion at 100,000 per coin, 100 billion dollars of USD value in those Bitcoin wallets. So I find it really interesting who this person might be, and I do find that this is a fairly plausible theory. It's not bulletproof, but it does seem quite plausible.
It
For
feels
either of you, does knowing who Satoshi is change your perception or response to Bitcoin? Meaning, like, would you be more bullish or bearish on Bitcoin overall if the identity of Satoshi was known? And then I guess as a consequence of that, if it was Jack Dorsey, does that make you, again, more or less, bullish, I suppose, on the asset as a whole?
It doesn't really matter to me. First off, I'm not super into crypto just in general. Like everything I know about has just been like because I'm in tech, I know people who are into crypto, and that's just like the level of conversation I have about it. But I also think like to me what's most plausible that Satoshi's just some like anonymous Redditor nerd who was thinking a lot about a problem and published a white paper anonymously about a thing and happened to click. That's the way I look at it, to be honest. I feel like that's the most probable. To me, like that story is too random for it to be like someone who actually has like a public image to maintain, you know?
So why? Let's just pull on the thread there. So, like, if there was a random Redditor nerd who was way deep in cryptography and how all of these things work, let's just say that was the case. Why would they not do any transactions from basically 2010 to now?
I don't know. That's what I'm saying though. Like especially like I think there's just like a this writing a white paper about a topic that you're just so interested in is not a behavior of someone who like wants an image online. And so maybe that wallet was just doing well enough, crypto took off well enough that if this were a person who just like wants to keep a private life, they stop transacting, they just let the money accrue, and that's a thing that they hold as an asset.
But for the
So yeah.
vast majority of those possible people, they would
Yeah.
want to realize some personal, even if it's a small amount, some
Yeah.
personal financial gain that they could use
Mhm.
to impact their life, right? Rather than sitting on
Probably.
the entirety of that block for that
Hmm.
entire period of time. You might say the person died. I could imagine something like that. But the scenario where a cryptography nerd
Hmm.
writes this and then has over 1 million Bitcoin in wallets and does
Hmm.
nothing from 2010 to now would suggest they're either not alive or they're already wealthy in some other capacity that they don't need this, right? This is like this has some meaning beyond financial for them that
Hmm.
is such a strong incentive that they either don't need the money or don't care about the money and want the global impact instead.
Let
Yeah,
me
I
let
could.
me
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I want to riff a little bit on the back of that. I want to agree with part of it, and then I want to push back on part of it for the sake of discussion. Again, I don't know that I believe either of these things, but I actually agree with you that the fact that there hasn't been any liquidation event basically over that time period does indicate the likelihood that these people, whomever they were, individual or group, are independently wealthy outside of this. I That said, I think I am, if I had to come down on a side of this, I'm probably more of the opinion that this white paper was a collection of efforts of people who wanted to remain anonymous, either because they didn't want to be at the forefront of this movement for one reason or the other, or they're playing an exceptionally long infinite game in which they're trying to exercise a long tail of value acquisition accruement because they don't actually need the money right now. So I guess in separating the question, like I'm not even sure that Satoshi is a single person. I think it might actually be an entity figurehead, kind of a pseudonym, as you said, on behalf of an organized group of people. That to me feels equally plausible. Again, not disputing any of the evidence put forth that it's Jack Dorsey or otherwise, but I do think the one thing I am gaining confidence in and have kind of always had confidence in is this person was independently wealthy, this person or group before they started Bitcoin. I think that's absolutely true.
How so for the record, like the idea that the Satoshi wallets haven't had a transaction on them for the last decade and some was not a thing I knew. But is that how is it linked that like we know Satoshi is the person who wrote the white paper and we also know this person group, whatever it may be, this entity holds these wallets. How do we know those are the same person?
Some wallet had to start this whole process. So that's there's obviously not a part of cryptography and Bitcoin is not knowing the identity of the wallet holder. So there is not like that perfect set of information that you're asking about, that you know the identity of the holder of a wallet, but you can see which blocks were mined first, um, and there's an assumption of a certain set based on both the traffic. So Satoshi had communication with people for years, as an identity before stopping communication. I believe in 2011 was the last communication from Satoshi. But Satoshi communicated with human beings and email and other things, IRC channels. And so Satoshi would come up with an agreement to send a certain amount of Bitcoin to someone, and then they would get Bitcoin from a wallet. So there was sort of a way to associate this thing. Now, you could say the person who wrote the white paper wasn't the person who had the wallets, but that's sort of the presumption that is being made. But there's no counter evidence to that, at least from that time period.
Yeah, because I'm not also familiar with the kind of origins of this specific ledger, I guess the natural question would then be, has there been transactions by the same entity or entities through a different wallet? Meaning, like, yes, sure, the original wallet that did the original mining would be linked to the originator of Bitcoin, Satoshi or otherwise, and then 2 years later spin up a secondary wallet that wouldn't be, yes, the gains on that wallet wouldn't be as high, but would still be high enough to be independently wealthy of their own right. So it could be the fact that they're just running other alternative transactions on the same blockchain through kind of masked wallets because they don't trace back to the origin of the chain itself.
And it could very well be, and maybe we end on this point, it could very well be that Satoshi had some wallets and lost his private key. Oops. Never wanted to fess up that he threw away his private key. Yeah. All right. So maybe on that we wrap. Thanks for joining us. Subscribe, like us, and we'll drop you some more content soon. Thanks, guys.
Add a little,